So the inclusion or the expansion of the MSCI China inclusion, I think, is very important for China. It's obviously a milestone for the market in itself. So that's a high-profile event. It's obviously important for investors simply because a lot of money passively follows those indices. So you simply will see more money flow into China. What's more significant, or certainly or hopefully more significant, is how does it really affect Chinese companies? Will it make a fundamental difference to many of the poor practices within China? There, I think it's very much mixed. That simply being included in the MSCI does not make a company better. Ultimately, companies are run by individuals who have to make corporate decisions and management decisions. But what I hopefully would like to think is that MSCI will act as a catalyst for many of the better managers to basically say, I now have an audience of international investors, and by running my company better, I'm going to attract more investors, have a higher profile, which hopefully should lead to a better valuation for his company. So it's interesting. So pretty much for the past 15 years or so, all new stock market innovations in terms of new boards and sort of interesting listings have been down in Shenzhen. Shenzhen had pushed ahead, moving away from the traditional state-owned enterprise type of model, embracing smaller private companies, startup companies, and indeed they have their own growth enterprise market called the China X down there, which has listed hundreds of companies. Shanghai has certainly felt a bit left out. It is playing catch-up to some extent with the new board, so there's obviously rivalry between the exchanges. Shanghai Exchange themselves makes the point that they're trying to go for better quality tech, whereas Shenzhen, they would claim, is only going for growth. But they're really trying to sort of pick winners, as it were, in Shanghai. That perhaps is maybe a bit worrying, that perhaps this is a state-directed initiative rather than really embracing the market. But having said that, the new board is very important if it comes to fruition as it's been explained, because it's going to be a registration process instead of a harsh approval process. So you will now it's going to reduce requirements on profitability, so you'll have a broader range of companies listing. And hopefully you will be able to see more of basically corporate China list. Remember, a large portion of the economy is joint ventures, and they simply cannot list in any fashion at the moment. They're outside the listing framework. So you'd like to think that the template, at least, regardless of location, will actually allow a much broader listing framework. Thankfully, of all the years I've spent in the Chinese stock market, I thankfully don't need to necessarily pick the sectors or pick the stocks. So I'll leave that to the people I speak to. Having said that, you would think, of course there are, that in such a large country with such a creative populace, with such a diversity of type of businesses and economic models, and that there's going to be winners there. I think the difficulty is finding them, first of all. Are they getting access, are they even simply getting access to grow their business that they can even get to the stage of being listed? That so much of listing has been a reward for state-owned enterprises, or bank lending obviously has been directed not to the private sector but to the state. So just seeing those companies can often be difficult to begin with. But there's no reason to think that China shouldn't be able to grow world-class companies, or certainly leading companies within China. I'd like to think that the market's going to be open enough for foreign investors to come in, find those opportunities. But you would have to be optimistic that that can happen. Well, I think it's worth remembering that the whole listing process, going back way into the early 90s, and particularly when H-shares were listed in Hong Kong, the argument there was that here we're taking state-owned enterprises, generally regional, provincial state-owned enterprises, we're going to take them, bring in foreign capital, foreign ownership, part foreign ownership, and that will somehow improve governance. And there's very little evidence to show that that happens. Ultimately, if you're bringing in private investors, whether they're foreign, whether they're domestic Chinese, when minority stakes with no oversight, management, control, then it's very difficult to see how the company is going to change. Simply changing the shareholding structure or the ownership structure fundamentally isn't going to change it. If the government really wants to improve these state-owned enterprises, they have to remove the S from the equation. They can no longer be state-owned. The government should simply sell them to the private sector if they feel this is a company worth developing. And of course, you've seen that across the globe in many environments, where in many countries where you have the state selling out of certain sectors and allowing the private sector to flourish. Of course, we don't seem to see that happening in China, certainly not on a grand scale. And I think, sadly, the public-private partnership is more a case of, in some cases, the governments or local governments having run out of money and looking for the private sector to come in and help bail them out. But simply mixing the ownership is not going to have a fundamental change. When you're looking at the markets, I think China has done a very good job for traditionally we'd be seen as an emerging market, and simply the operational mechanics of things. China is a market that once you've been approved and you've got through your hurdles and you're set up, it functions remarkably well. Operationally, it does function remarkably well. There's a lot of information out there. You can buy and sell and make sure you know you're going to get your money. They've made substantial improvements on repatriation for people who've come in through the QFII route. Obviously, Hong Kong Connect as well has provided a very easy access channel. So in terms of the operational stuff of just processing stuff, it's very good. Clearly, where areas need to improve is the quality of companies themselves. That can partly be done through listing. It could partly be done through sort of market discipline and investor discipline, that investors basically shun poor companies. But there's also financial disclosure that comes into that. And of course, one area which the Chinese have promised this year under the new QFI rules is just simply a much greater opening of the market. That while Connect is certainly useful, it's still a limited role. And from the people I speak to in Beijing, very much QFII is seen as the front door to the market, coming in the front door, getting the full access of products available, registering yourself, being known to the Chinese authorities, whereas Connect is more a side door or back door, which provides us a purpose to allow some trading, some retail investment, but it's not the main avenue by which they want you to invest. I think that, so before, if we're holding out for China to become as open as, say, the US or European markets or even Japan or even Hong Kong, then I think we're going to be waiting for a very long time. There's no reason to think that with a country that's going to maintain capital controls for decades to come, frankly, that you're going to see simply them taking their hand off the stock market, or at least from an approval process. But that need not necessarily be a problem. India, by contrast, has literally thousands, nearly 10,000 foreign registered investors who come in. They ultimately lowered the requirements. They made it easier to register. You come in, you prove who you are, you have full access to the markets. They're able to control as well, or at least monitor what money's coming in and what money's going out. The currency in India is fully convertible for stock transactions, so you can't just bring money in to punt the currency. And there's no reason China can't have a similar model. They still have visibility, they still have a degree of control, but it's still open enough that foreigners can access it relatively straightforwardly. So for nearly a decade now, China has been trying to actively push the renminbi as an internationalized currency, or internationalize its currency. And of course, for decades they had, by their own choice, and made it extremely restrictive that basically nobody used renminbi except for domestic transactions within China. Various rule and policy changes meant a substantial growth in Hong Kong and offshore deposits. And certainly for a time, as those deposits grew and the currency strengthened, there was a feeling that there was real momentum behind the currency. I think, though, that there are very few people now who see this as ultimately, they see that more as an aberration. We're now back in an environment, even though it's in the SDR basket of the IMF, the reality is that the currency is not being freed up anytime soon. It's still highly political, the level. They're still very sensitive towards capital controls. And so when you put that together, there's very little reason to think that the renminbi is going to be a true reserve currency in the way that it's certainly not displacing the dollar anytime soon. And frankly, it's even struggling to try and displace the pound, which is going through its own travails, certainly not the euro or even the yen. Ultimately, people will use the renminbi, but they're only ever going to use it if there's a China leg to the transaction. It would be virtually impossible to see how two non-Chinese entities would use renminbi to settle. And of course, the simple, or part of the reason for that is that China makes it still so restrictive to do things. Even in Hong Kong, where there's a developed offshore market, it's very difficult to borrow the currency. The government and the banks still interfere in the market there. And so it's going to be many, many years to come. The reality is in China's capital markets, it's going to remain relatively restricted, certainly going to be high oversight, and the government is not departing the scene anytime soon.